By the mid-17th century, St George's Day, already undermined by 200 years of Protestant assault, had reached an unprecedented low point. His saintly image had long been fading, and with his royal and knightly ties now severed after the Civil War, his absence left a void in the national psyche. In its place, a new inclusive identity, at least in theory, arose, rooted in James I's efforts to unite England and Scotland under a single British banner. But the quiet persistence of St George's Day reminds us his presence was never fully erased. Tradition endured, at least in part, because people crave the comfort of archetypes, heroes, protectors, things that a flag alone cannot replace. In this chapter, we'll explore what came next, an era of unification, rising domestic suspicion and growing imperial ambition that stretched far beyond England's shores. New symbols emerged to shape Britain's identity, born from the ashes of ancient myths, casting shadows across continents as, all the while, whispers of the past still lingered. What happens when the heroes we once honoured fade away? How does a nation rebuild its soul? Long before St George was dethroned as the reigning symbol of England's identity, another figure had already been quietly pushed aside, the Virgin Mary. Though central to medieval Christianity, she was more than mere doctrine. She was a vital presence, Mother of Mercy, Queen of Heaven, a vessel of grief, love, and intercession. Through shrines, hymns, feast days, and shared rituals, especially among women, she offered what few symbols could, a sense of emotional continuity and shared meaning. Traditions like the May crowning, where young girls adorned her statue with flowers, symbolised purity and devotion, and the little office of the Blessed Virgin Mary, once widely recited, wove Marian reflection into the fabric of daily spiritual life. And so, her sudden removal during the Reformation marked more than just a theological shift. It was a cultural unmooring, the unmistakable loss of a spiritual mother. Yet even in her absence, Mary's archetype remained, a still present mark on a realm increasingly unwilling to accept her authority. Her serene, powerful image laid much of the symbolic groundwork to pave the way for England's female monarchs. Mary I, Elizabeth I, Mary II, and Queen Anne, two even sharing her name. Though political tensions often overshadowed this legacy, her archetype created a template of rule rooted in continuity, stewardship, and divine right. A Queen of Heaven who embodied maternal strength and nurturing authority, not ambition, conquest, or expansion. This stood in sharp contrast to a figure who would soon rise in her place, not merely replacing Mary, but unsettling the symbolic balance emerging between Mary and George. In part 1, we saw how Mary once stood alongside George and Edward as a candidate for chief patron of the Order of the Garter. Together they formed a kind of mythic triad: George the Defender, Edward the Just, and Mary the Consoler. Her presence was no footnote, it was foundational, and as George gradually overshadowed Edward, he and Mary came to form a divine axis, often paired as co-patrons or joint symbols. George, the gallant protector; Mary, the ever-present comforter. She represented emotional intimacy, a living image of solace and shared memory. When Marian devotion was dismantled, the emotional architecture underpinning England's Christian identity effectively collapsed. The feminine divine, the soul of the people's religion, was exiled. St George, by contrast, resisted longer. A masculine icon of chivalry, warfare, and national pride, a figure of noble sacrifice. His ties to knightly orders and royal tradition made him indispensable for a time. But as England's religious and political identity fractured, his symbolic power too began to fade. In the psychological framework of a culture, closely mirroring the dynamics of the family unit, the mother carries tradition and memory, while the father draws boundaries and defines collective action. In England, both were gradually removed. First the mother, silenced, then the father, undone by conflict. It's no accident then that in Ireland, where Catholic devotion endured and Mary remained central, nationalism would develop with a more expressive, poetic, and grounded tone, rooted deeply in the land. The mother remained, and with her, an unshakable sense of home, a soul that still belonged to the people. But as for England, its mythic compass increasingly untethered, the country pressed on towards global expansion, its oldest symbols stripped away. Without Mary or George steering the ship, the collective psyche was left unparented, drifting without anchor. And as the reach of the nation grew, so too did its need for a new figurehead. Though the figures of Mary and George had receded from England's symbolic imagination, their names lingered in the royal line. Mary I, who pushed back against the Protestant tide, and the Georges 1 to 4, who reigned during an age when St George had become little more than ceremonial memory. It was as if the names themselves had the power to outlast the myths that once gave them meaning. But what happens when the mother of a people disappears? How does a nation find its way without her guiding hand? In the distance, Britannia was waiting. While 17th century England continued to strip away its sacred images, a new chapter was unfolding across the Atlantic. In New England, Puritans, frustrated by the slow pace of reform, sought to build a purer Christian society, cleansed of Catholic and Anglican influence, a beacon to inspire the homeland and the world beyond. After the Pilgrims' 1620 landing, a larger wave followed in the 1630s, founding Massachusetts Bay, New Haven, and Rhode Island's colonies. These settlers brought with them not only a theology, but a sharp cultural rejection. Like their counterparts back home, they banned Christmas and Easter celebrations and denounced all popish forms of worship. No hymns, no statues, no crucifixes. Even the Virgin Mary, once the tender heart of Christian devotion, was recast as a dangerous idol. For many, this meant spiritual liberation. For others, it was a personal crisis, a disorienting break with the past. But not all English colonies followed the same path. In 1634, Cecil Calvert founded Maryland as a refuge for persecuted English Catholics. Named Terra Mariae, Mary's Land, it honoured both the Catholic Henrietta Maria, wife of King Charles I, and of course the Virgin alike. Here, Marian devotion continued. Statues adorned chapels, feast days were kept, and the rhythms of life retained echoes of the old world. A true sanctuary for the new minority, Catholic practice gained formal protection by the 1649 Maryland Toleration Act, a rare legal refuge at the time amid rising Protestant dominance in many parts of Europe and among most of the American settlements. Maryland became not just a safe haven, but a window into another England, one where the mother had never been exiled. The emotional contrast was stark. While Puritanism offered clarity, discipline, and moral rigour, it left little room for tenderness. No figure to whom the grieving could cry, no intercessor to share the burden of sorrow. In Maryland, the sacred feminine was preserved in daily life, and with her, a memory of spiritual balance that many elsewhere had forgotten. Still, it wasn't only in her Catholic refuge or in Mary herself that fragments of older identity survived. By the late 18th century, St. George societies began appearing in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Charlestown. Fraternal organisations offering mutual aid, cultural fellowship, and a celebration of English heritage for communities that had crossed the ocean for America. Stripped of overt Catholic associations, St. George's image remained a usable emblem, a link to home, to knighthood, and to a shared mythic past. In short, he felt like England. So these societies thrived. More than ceremonial, they helped English settlers navigate the upheaval of religious migration and cultural reinvention, offering a symbolic foothold in a fast-changing world. All this said, America wouldn't settle for inherited myths forever, and as the New World matured, its own national symbols began to emerge. In 1789, George Washington, the general who refused a crown, emerged as a kind of secular saint. Revered across the colonies, he embodied a new kind of hero, not the holy warrior, but the virtuous citizen leader, courageous, restrained, and self-sacrificing in a different way. Washington's mythology filled a psychological need left by discarded saints, a protector not by divine right, but by republican virtue. And unlike leaders such as Cromwell before him, he laid down power rather than reshaping it in his own image. All the while, around him rose a new pantheon of international figureheads, female personifications of liberty and moral strength, modelled on classical goddesses of Greece and Rome. France's Marianne became the spirit of revolution, while the Statue of Liberty, a French-American collaboration, stood in New York Harbour as a symbol of freedom and enlightenment. These figures were modern myths stitched from ancient cloth, the new faces of revolution and democracy, leading the long march towards modernity. This marked a profound archetypal shift. While England's saints and queens were fading into memory, America reassembled its national soul from much older fragments, repurposed and rebranded. The result was a symbolic tightrope, a republic caught between the pull of modern secularism and the persistence of ancestral forms. Even its most modern figures, Liberty, Washington, echoed ancient archetypes. And yet, these new icons were somehow lacking. Unlike St. George or the Virgin Mary, Washington and Liberty didn't live in churches or in the personal rituals of everyday life. They were public, distant and monumental. Harder to reach out and touch, they offered aspiration, but not intimacy. Meanwhile, back across the Atlantic, the story of St. George and Mary hadn't ended with Cromwell. Long before Liberty raised her torch, Britain had already crowned a predecessor. Her name was Britannia. As we saw in the last chapter, the monarchy's collapse during the Civil War gave rise to the Commonwealth, a short-lived experiment in republicanism and strict Puritan control. Saints' days, Christmas, and many cultural rituals that had once defined the calendar were banned outright. But the weight of this new order soon strained under its own contradictions. In the absence of monarchy, and without a mythic patron or clear symbolic centre, England was left grappling with serious questions of legitimacy and identity. Cromwell's parliament had toppled the crown, but it simply couldn't offer the cultural and spiritual grounding the monarchy once had. Despite Puritanism's call for a simpler, more direct relationship with God, the monarchy had, ultimately, represented a different expression of that same desire, a link to the divine. Without the king, long regarded as God's chosen representative, the nation was fractured until the experiment inevitably concluded. In the end, the Commonwealth was undone by the very forces it tried to suppress, the deep need for continuity and the enduring power of shared myth. As we saw in the last video, when Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, the fragile system he built began to unravel, and without the authority to hold it together, his son and successor, Richard Cromwell, was eventually forced into exile. In much the same way the dramatic pendulum swings of the Tudor era had bred cycles of repression and backlash, the Commonwealth's rigid cultural censorship alienated a large portion of the population. Cromwell's military regime offered freedom from a monarch, yes, but at what cost to the personal freedom of the people? So, in 1660, the army and parliament extended an invitation to Charles II to reclaim the throne his father had lost. The monarchy quickly reasserted ceremonial traditions, including the revival of the Order of the Garter, still tied to St. George as its patron, as well as officially restoring holidays like Christmas. As a result, St. George's Day celebrations finally resumed at court. But this revival was still largely confined to the upper echelons of society. Among the people, unlike Christmas, St. George's Day was already on its last legs long before Cromwell's final blow. A saint of suffering and spiritual protection had become little more than a gentleman's crest. But much like in America, given his Catholic underpinnings, that would strangely work to his advantage. The late 17th century was a fragile moment in history. The Restoration may have recrowned a king, but Protestantism, once a challenger to the established order, was hardening into the new national dogma, all while the wounds of civil war and spiritual chaos still ran deep beneath the surface. The Stuarts understood this tension all too well. James and Charles I both negotiated the difficult path of leading a Protestant country while suspected of secret Catholic leanings. Charles II, though outwardly Protestant, converted to Catholicism on his deathbed, a private act that underscored the public danger of admitting Catholic loyalties in a fiercely Protestant nation, and who could blame him given the fate of his father. After Charles's conversion, only one more Catholic would sit on the throne. And not for long. In 1688, James II, the last openly Catholic monarch, was swiftly deposed in the Glorious Revolution, a name only slightly tilted in favour of the Protestant victors, and replaced by his daughter Mary II and her Dutch husband, William of Orange. Their reign, the only joint monarchy in British history, was brief but decisive. It set a bold and lasting precedent that a monarch needed to be not only Protestant, but also acceptable to Parliament. Sovereignty now rested on three conditions: bloodline, parliamentary consent, and strict adherence to the correct faith. The 1701 Act of Settlement formalised this revolutionary move. that all and every person and persons who shall or may take or inherit the said crown, and shall profess the popish religion, or shall marry a papist, shall be excluded. This barred Catholics from the throne, a rule that, though softened in 2013 to allow royals to marry Catholics once more, still stands for the monarch themselves. Protestantism was no longer just a religion. It had become the scaffolding of a new British national identity. This tightening of what was considered religiously acceptable was mirrored in how the past became remembered and rewritten. Mary I, once a Catholic queen in her own right, had her image tarred by Protestant historians. Branded Bloody Mary, she became a convenient scapegoat for centuries of collective anxiety and national trauma. Her actual policies and death tolls may have paled compared to other Tudor monarchs, though incomplete records and possible smoothing over by the Protestant victors make direct comparison difficult. In any case, myth has its own rules. Mary had to become a monster, and Catholic absolutism had to remain the number one enemy of the age. Because the Protestant ascendancy in Britain was never just about faith. The looming shadow of powerful Catholic neighbours like Spain and Portugal, with their sprawling empires and close ties to the Vatican, represented an existential threat. To many Britons, the Catholic other wasn't so much a different church. It was a force intent on overriding England's national freedom and stripping away its independence and sovereign identity. What began as a defensive posture, rooted in religious protection and parliamentary politics, soon became the engine of imperial ambition. A nation once defined by resistance began suppressing many of its own people in the name of liberty. Over time, this drive would transform a provincial underdog into a global power, as fear of subjugation gave way to the desire to rule. But even after the Glorious Revolution, the Stuart dynasty stood on unsteady ground. Anne, Mary's sister and the last of her line, faced the same fate that once haunted Elizabeth I. They were both queens without an heir, and the echoes ran deeper. Both ruled alone in a male-dominated world, weathered intense religious divisions, and upheld the Protestant faith without tipping too far into dogmatism. And just as Elizabeth's death ushered in the uncertain rise of the Stuarts, Anne's passing stirred fresh fears of foreign rule and fractured legitimacy. The crisis that followed wasn't just a mirror of the century before, it completed the pattern. The end of the Stuarts, like the end of the Tudors, forced the kingdom to confront its own identity once more. As royal power evolved, so too did its mythology. For all the constitutional reform, the Stuarts' influence went beyond legislating who could rule or redefining the limits of monarchy's power. It reshaped the very symbols of the nation. What James I began in 1606 as an emblematic unification of the crowns culminated a century later under Queen Anne in the 1707 Act of Union. England and Scotland were now joined as one political entity, the Kingdom of Great Britain. With that shift, English identity began to dissolve into a broader British framework, and the symbols that once defined it, including St George, began to lose their central place. His red cross still flew, but it was no longer the flag of a nation. Now it was stitched into the newly sanctioned Union flag. A slow creep from James's earlier push, this new emblem began appearing not just on naval ships, but also military uniforms and royal buildings, a signal of not only the joining of nations, but of Britain's rising presence as a leading player on the world stage. Following the official birth of Britain in 1707, a further Act of Union was passed in 1801. This time incorporating Ireland as well. The red saltire of St Patrick was added to the design, creating the modern Union flag we know today. The transformation was complete. The once simple emblem of St George, now part of a complex imperial weave. England was no longer a solitary kingdom, but a single patch in the wider fabric of a growing union. For many, the transformation didn't register overnight. St George's cross still flew from churches and local guild halls. It still mattered, deeply familiar to a people who had known it for centuries. At first, the Union flag, though backed by the state, felt distant, a symbol of politics more than public sentiment. But forging a new imperial identity required more than passive acceptance. To overcome memory and reshape allegiance, those in power began to steer the symbolic imagination in a new direction. The saint's story had faded, and as the century wore on, it became clear. Britain's new identity needed more than a flag. It needed a figurehead, a unifying icon to embody the raw authority and ambition of an emerging global power. Enter Britannia. Once a name for the island itself, her name, drawn from Latin inscriptions and imperial maps, was first personified in Hadrian's coinage, where she appeared as a seated warrior, cloaked, helmeted, and armed with shield and trident. After Rome's retreat, her image lay dormant until 1672, when Charles II revived it on the newly minted coins of his restored kingdom. But this time, rather than Roman standards, her shield bore the Union flag. Britannia had returned, reborn as a symbol of British power. By the 19th century, Britannia had become the face of Britain's burgeoning empire, poised, commanding, unmistakably British. Her image spread from coins to seals and public monuments. In Victorian imagination, she was no longer just a guardian of a realm, but mother of an empire, rallying troops, shielding colonies, standing alongside other personified nations like India and Canada. She was maternal, martial, monumental, all at once. Britannia's harder, martial edge increasingly echoed another female warrior from Britain's mythic past, Boudica. Though historically distinct, the two figures became entangled in the cultural imagination, especially in times of war. Britannia stood for the forward-facing order of empire, Boudica the wild defiance of tribal revolt. One ruled with a trident, the other rebelled with a spear. One defended the state, the other raged against it. But together, they became twin archetypes of British might, conquest and resistance bound together in myth. Thomas Thornycroft's statue near Westminster Bridge, completed around 1902, captures this strange fusion. Boudica surges forward in her war chariot, daughters at her side, eternally charging towards the seat of Parliament. The rebel queen cast in bronze at the heart of the empire she once opposed. For all their power, these were inverted symbols. Just as Britain, in its sphere of Catholic absolutism, adopted the imagery of Roman dominion, so too did it turn the face of Celtic resistance into a symbol of the imperial state. Britannia, the ghost of Rome; Boudica, the fury of its foes, now riding in its service. The irony was, Britannia never truly belonged to England. Her imagery was unmistakably classical: the crested helmet of Athena, Poseidon's trident, the robes of an ancient goddess. Even her name came not from the native tradition, but from Latin maps and imperial coinage. And yet, at the very moment Britain was defining itself against Catholic Europe, against absolutism, papal authority, and the legacy of Rome, it was embracing Rome's visual language of power more tightly than ever, rejecting the Pope but welcoming the eagle, fearing divine kingship but fashioning itself after emperors. This paradox of rejecting old authority while adopting its symbols gave Britain a unique visual language, one that resonated far beyond its shores. Just as the Roman Republic inspired nations across the world to cast off the shackles of monarchy, Britannia's renewed image sparked the creation of new stately figures. The Protestants who once denounced idols were now fashioning their own, drawn not from Christian scripture, but pagan sculpture. So, inspired by Britain's revival of Britannia, other nations turned to goddesses of their own. As we saw, France gave us Marianne, America, Lady Liberty. Like Britannia, they were feminine, robed and often armed, but theirs were born of revolution and enlightenment, not monarchy and empire. Britannia defended the crown, Marianne toppled it. Liberty did not charge into battle, she waited in the harbour, welcoming new arrivals. And yet, despite their political differences, they almost seemed to blur into one. The same goddess, different pose. And with each new incarnation, this many-faced figure seemed to reach further towards the summit of Olympus. Lady Liberty in particular was a striking hybrid, part Britannia, part Colossus of Rhodes, modelled on Helios, the Greek sun god and forebear of Apollo. The old Roman gods, once fallen, now rose again, reborn in copper and steel, waving new flags. The spirit of Rome was taking hold. But while these icons rose, others were buried. In earlier centuries, England's heavenly guardians were saints and martyrs, figures like St. George and St. Michael, both known for treading evil underfoot. Their imagery was unmistakable: sword drawn, serpent crushed, a holy light standing against corruption. But Britannia was no saint battling darkness. Where once the dragon lay underfoot, now it was the world itself. She didn't slay the serpent, she replaced it. The protector standing over evil gave way to a goddess enthroned on her pedestal, demanding reverence. According to legend, George died denouncing the gods of the ancient world. Now their emissaries had returned, wielding Poseidon's trident and bearing the light of Apollo. The very idols he defied were now exalted in bronze, venerated by the nation he once defended and by the republic it had helped inspire. If Roma was the mother of Rome, Britannia became her imperial daughter, now cast as the mother of Britain. Not a spiritual mother like Mary, but a figure of the state. Armoured, impersonal, imperial. In its drive to become something greater, England dimmed its brightest colours, quietly erasing its oldest allies to better blend in. Its identity folded into the Union, but its symbols haunted the royal halls where they had been quietly relegated. The names Mary I to Mary II, George I to George IV lingered like ghosts of myths the nation no longer fully embraced, yet couldn't quite let go. Mary II reclaimed her name from the shadow of Bloody Mary, subtly reshaping how the nation remembered its past. The Hanoverian Georges, foreign kings chosen as the closest non-Catholic heirs after Queen Anne's death, were distant strangers to the land. George I could hardly speak English, but on paper, at least his name sounded English, a German dynasty cloaked in English heritage. Amid revolutions, unions and foreign rulers, familiar names like Mary, George and Edward offered a veneer of stability, instruments of continuity in uncertain times. They remained not as living ideals but as ritual echoes, familiar, hollowed and quietly repurposed. By the 19th century, the monarchy had ceased creating myths. It merely wore their costumes. Monarchs wielded English symbolism. Portraits adorned with the blue garter of the Order, the Garter's star, and the medallion of St. George. But their meaning had faded, reduced to ceremony. Much like Britannia's projected image, the monarchy's presence had grown theatrical. Quite literally so, as Parliament took centre stage. With Victoria's reign, Britain's secular mythology crystallised. Born Alexandrina, she chose a Latin name, not sacred, but timeless and imperial, one that looked forward to Britain's future, rather than back to England's past. And around the same time, Britain's naval might and imperial ambitions found their voice. James Thomson's 1740 poem, set to music by Thomas Arne, proclaimed Britain's dominion of the seas. Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. This song, embraced by both army and navy, became an anthem of empire. It was no hymn or prayer, it was a proud martial declaration. Thus, Britain marched into modernity, not led by saints, but by secular symbols. Britannia, once a romantic reimagining of Roman nobility, now ruled a global machine. Her trident no longer guarded an island, it pointed towards dominion over continents. Mary and George had been reduced to namesakes, their spiritual presence buried. In their place emerged a new parent, the state, and Britannia was its public face. The 19th century marked a turning point in Britain's story, an era when industry, empire and identity collided to reshape the nation's self-image. Fueled by the Industrial Revolution, the Queen's dominion expanded faster and farther than ever before. At the same time, ideas of what it meant to be English and British evolved in complex and often contradictory ways. By the mid-1800s, Britain had transformed from a largely rural society into the world's leading industrial power. Cities expanded rapidly, and for the first time, more Britons lived in towns than in the countryside. This urban growth was matched by a sweeping expansion of infrastructure, most dramatically the construction of over 13,500 miles of railway within just a few decades, binding far-flung regions into a single industrial economy. Factories filled the skies with smoke, especially in industrial hubs like Manchester and Glasgow. By mid-century, Britain was producing more iron than the rest of the world combined. Its cotton mills clothed people across continents, and by the 1870s, the country accounted for nearly a third of global manufacturing, despite making up just 2% of the world's population. It was an incredible transformation, built on the backs of working Britons, driven by ambition, ingenuity, and the grinding demands of industrial labour. And this industrial might didn't just transform the economy, it changed how people saw their place in the world, in their communities, and in the workplace. The rise of machines and factories, the spread of capitalism, and the increasing reach of government systems into everyday life all nudged society away from local, personal identities towards a broader, more impersonal sense of belonging, one tied to progress, productivity, and empire. But this new order came at a cost. Industrialisation deepened class divisions. Strong regional identities endured in Scotland, Wales, and especially Ireland, where Catholic communities remained marginalised. And across the empire, colonial subjects preserved distinct identities, complicating the notion of a single, unified Britishness. The story Britain told about itself was one of triumph, unity, and modernity, but it was never that simple. This industrial might propelled a vast territorial expansion beyond Britain's shores. In the century leading up to 1914, the empire absorbed some 10 million square miles. Maps in classrooms and government offices painted a glowing red sprawl, from Canada to India, Sudan to Singapore, all beneath Britannia's unblinking gaze. By Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, the empire claimed nearly a quarter of the Earth's land and ruled over 400 million people. School children recited that the sun never sets on the British Empire, and in a sense, the British project is still waiting for its sunset. While other nations were forging identities through democratic revolutions or secular nationalism, Britain's image became increasingly tethered to its imperial reach. Britishness was no longer a natural evolution of Englishness. It had become a projection cast across continents. To live under the Union flag was, in theory, to belong to something greater. In practice, that promise was tightly guarded. To many in the colonies, Britain's presence felt less like an invitation than an imposition, an identity enforced, not earned. And yet, paradoxically, many who supported British rule and the opportunities it offered came to believe in the very ideals Britain exported, that loyalty, service, and sacrifice could earn a place within the imperial family. If empire demanded allegiance, did it not owe belonging in return? This contradiction would cast a long shadow. In time, the ruled would challenge the rulers to live up to the values they had once preached. The sun never set, but one day its reflection would come knocking. All the while, as the empire grew, something subtle but profound was happening at home. The old English identity, rooted in village life, folk traditions, and county loyalties, began to give way. As the 20th century loomed, St. George's Day, still loosely marked in churches and civic halls, faded from national consciousness. For centuries, its place in the crowded spring calendar had been far from assured. The feast often overlapped with the shifting dates of Easter and the solemn observances of Holy Week, which drew far more attention. Just days later came St. Mark's Day, another religious commemoration, while the approach of May Day promised communal revelry and seasonal renewal. And by the early 19th century, Shakespeare's Day, sharing the exact same date, the 23rd of April, had established itself as a rival celebration, drawing civic and literary enthusiasm that competed with public memory of the saint's legacy. And it didn't end there. By the end of the century, even newer forces were reshaping the symbolic calendar. Labour movements had begun marking the 1st of May as International Workers' Day, adding political urgency to the month's rituals. Into this already dense symbolic landscape stepped Empire Day, not just a new holiday, but the centrepiece of a new civic mythology. First celebrated in Canada in the 1890s and adopted in Britain by 1904, Empire Day became a ritual of imperial loyalty. School children saluted the flag, sang patriotic hymns, and heard tales of explorers, administrators, and colonial victories. By 1919, over 27,000 schools took part. This wasn't merely a new date on the calendar, it marked a shift in symbolic allegiance. Where St. George's Day had once celebrated the saint's spiritual defiance and personal courage, Empire Day promoted systemic loyalty to crown, flag, and empire. One was rooted in faith and fable, the other in maps and metrics. The martyr's banner gave way to the administrator's stamp. This marked a crucial transformation. Imperial identity didn't just coexist with English tradition, it began to overwrite it. Britishness emerged as the dominant identity. It was printed on passports, taught in schools, and flown from government buildings to distant colonies. The Union flag replaced the St. George's Cross in official life. School curricula celebrated naval victories, explorers, and colonial governance rather than saints or regional folklore. This transformation of national identity was more than symbolic. It reflected a deep political and cultural shift. St. George, once a symbol of religious faith, personal bravery, and England's medieval past, was eclipsed by new ideals. Britannia now embodied a bureaucratic vision of empire. Heroism no longer meant slaying dragons, it meant governing provinces. Figures like Robert Clive and Warren Hastings became the new heroes, not for knightly virtue, but for enforcing imperial order. The nation had shifted from local loyalties and spiritual stories to global ambition and systemic control. Even the feminine ideal changed. Where once the Virgin Mary offered mercy and maternal protection, the state had taken the mother's place, not as nurturer, but as ruler. Britannia's rise captured this new order, a Britain no longer rooted in sacred tradition, but in projection and power. Still, the 19th century may have proclaimed a confident imperial identity, but it also laid the groundwork for future questions we still ask today. What does it mean to be British? And who gets to decide? As Victorian Britain transformed into a mechanised imperial society with sprawling cities, regimented factory lines, and the wider world at its doorstep, a deep cultural anxiety took hold. Artists, architects and writers turned backwards, not in despair, but in search of moral clarity. The Middle Ages offered a symbolic refuge, a vision of unity, honour and spiritual order, in contrast to the disenchantment and dislocation of modern life. Out of this nostalgia emerged a powerful symbolic countercurrent. The medieval knight returned, not as a feudal warrior, but as a moral ideal. Movements like the Gothic Revival and the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood wrapped Victorian values in medieval aesthetics. Their revival was not escapism, but a deliberate moral project, one that sought to give shape to modern British masculinity, imperial responsibility, and civic virtue. The chivalric code they resurrected, honour, duty, sacrifice, restraint, closely mirrored Victorian ideals, especially those tied to masculinity, family, and national purpose. In a world driven by steam and steel, the knight's armour became a metaphor for moral discipline. His sword no longer symbolised conquest, but defence, of the innocent, of beauty, of the moral order of the day. His stoicism and self-control embodied the stiff upper lip before the phrase even existed. This was a revival of Christian knighthood reshaped to fit the needs of empire. Figures like St. George, once a martyr who defied tyranny, were reimagined as spiritual patriarchs of a global order. He no longer represented personal faith so much as national character, protective, principled, enduring, a whisper of something England had forgotten it needed. The Pre-Raphaelites gave this ethic its most vivid artistic expression. Their lush medieval imagery wasn't mere decoration, it was a visual code. They held up the knight not only as myth, but as an aspiration, a balance of strength and sacrifice, masculinity and morality, tradition and virtue. It was a vision of English identity anchored in the past, but built to navigate the pressures of an expanding Britain. George's revival was slow and scattered. His name surfaced in patriotic ceremonies, the 1879 anthem, St. George for Merry England at the Royal Albert Hall, McFarren's St. George's Te Deum at the 1884 Crystal Palace exhibition. Colonial banquets invoked him with toasts and banners, but these were pageants, not living traditions. He was being remembered at last, but not yet restored. The patron saint of England had long been symbolically exiled, pushed aside by the Reformation, and later eclipsed by the Empire. Unlike St. Andrew or St. Patrick, George lacked a grassroots following. His feast day, the 23rd of April, passed mostly unnoticed. In 1882, all the year round, remarked, "We went to the opposite extreme, lost all pride in our individuality, forgot our patron saint, and allowed his festival to sink into oblivion." It is to be doubted if half a dozen educated Englishmen out of every 100 know the day of their patron saint. The contrast with Scotland, Ireland and Wales was glaring. Their saints were honoured with parades, music, dinners. England, dominant yet curiously rootless, lacked a civic ritual to call its own. An 1898 review tersely captured this identity crisis. Not so your Englishmen. St. George's Day, though it chances to be Shakespeare's Day too, is merely the 23rd of April. And England is but a geographical expression. Ironically, it was in the English diaspora, not the English homeland, where the saint found his most loyal guardians to keep the legacy alive. In the United States and Canada, expatriates founded St. George's societies, celebrating the day with pageantry and charity. These societies preserved a vision of English identity untethered from the British state, rooted instead in memory, myth, and ritual. Victorians watching this began to wonder, if it could flourish abroad, why was this identity missing at home? In 1894, two Londoners, Howard Ruff and Harry W. Christmas, founded the Society of St. George to answer that question. Its mission? To awaken patriotic Englishmen and Englishwomen and revive pride in English values, history, and tradition. Queen Victoria agreed to be its first royal patron, Edward VII later granting it the full title, the Royal Society of St. George. At a time when Britain ruled the globe, the RSSG sought something simpler, not to reject Britishness, but to humanise it, to put the soul of England back into the heart of the Union. The Society promoted the 23rd of April, organised events, and worked to restore George's visibility. But even with royal support, it struggled to gain ground. Empire had remade the symbolic order. The image of the knight had little place in a world ruled by bureaucracy and profit. Reclaiming St. George might seem quaint in the shadow of empire, but it was more than mere nostalgia. Britishness was a political structure, legal systems, institutions, and military force. Englishness was something older, quieter, a buried cultural root, a sense of place, a character shaped by landscape, memory, and shared myth. For many, especially in the rising middle class of England's new industrial cities, identity still clung to county, story, and soil. Reclaiming St. George wasn't so much a rejection of the empire, it was a quiet assertion. England had a soul, and it was worth remembering. The revival of St. George offered more than comfort or nostalgia. It pointed to something deeper, a hunger for moral clarity, for a father figure, not defined by crown or constitution, but by sacrifice. A story that demanded courage, not just loyalty. By the end of the century, the British machine had proven it could generate power. But could it still offer meaning? In the absence of an answer, the figure of St. George, once a martyr, now a ghost, lingered at the edges of national consciousness. Somewhat revered, but remote. Present once more, but powerless. And it would take a catastrophe to bring him back to life. By the late 18th century, the once unassailable idea of the divine right of kings had long been unravelling. The English Civil War had delivered the first catastrophic blow. Charles I was not just deposed, but publicly executed as a man who still dared claim godlike authority. The unstable Commonwealth that followed nevertheless proved that England could survive, and in some ways even innovate, without a monarch. When Charles II returned in 1660, it was not by sacred right, but at the invitation of Parliament. The monarchy had returned, but on a much shorter leash. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 marked the final rupture. James II was deposed without civil war, and the crown was formally offered to William and Mary by Parliament's will. The Bill of Rights, passed the following year, codified the new order. Kings would now rule by law, not divine right. Over the next century, real political power shifted steadily towards Parliament, while monarchs, especially the Hanoverians, receded into symbolic roles. By George III's reign, the transformation to constitutional monarchy was nearly complete. So when George III descended into probable psychosis in the 1780s, a moment often softened in memory as mere eccentricity, it was more than a personal crisis. It was a symbolic reckoning. The sovereign, once imagined as the moral anchor of the realm, was now visibly fallible. His collapse mirrored a nation under strain, reeling from the loss of America, watching revolution unfold in France, and lurching towards an industrial future that few could fully understand. The paternal idea of kingship, strong, wise, and divinely guided, had cracked. The myth of sovereign certainty could no longer hold. By the time Victoria ascended to the throne in 1837, monarchy had become performance. But unlike her Hanoverian predecessors who shrank from public life as Parliament rose, Victoria stepped into the spotlight. Rather than resist monarchy's transformation, she embodied it. Shrewdly, or perhaps instinctively, she embraced her new symbolic role. Her reign coincided with Britain's imperial high tide, and she became its moral figurehead. Not a warrior queen, but a maternal sovereign cloaked in domestic virtue and imperial dignity. She was not just a monarch, but a national archetype, Britannia made flesh. A mother of 9, Victoria was cast as matriarch of a vast imperial family, and quite literally the grandmother of Europe. Her children married into royal houses across the continent, binding the British monarchy to the courts of Germany, Russia, and beyond. Her likeness appeared on coins and statues from Delhi to Cape Town, embodying not just the empire's reach, but its moral posture. Hers was a monarchy of presence, commanding loyalty through image more than through law. In her, the empire found a maternal face, the Queen of Britain, the Queen of Empire. But Queen of Heaven was not a role that could be played. The Reformation had exiled Mary from the national imagination, and no sovereign, however beloved, could truly replace her. A similar pattern unfolded in religion. Catholicism, long cast as foreign, hierarchical and irrational, became the un-English faith, and in rejecting its symbols, Mary, saints, ritual, Britain lost access to some of the deepest emotional and spiritual resources of its past. Protestant restraint became national character, rational, orderly, efficient, stereotypically matching its German monarchs. But this came at a price. The rejection of intimacy created a symbolic void, the same void that haunted its monarchy. Britishness came to be defined less by what it cherished than what it rejected. Mystery, feeling, visible suffering. It became a culture of negation. By the height of the empire, Britain had a maternal sovereign, but no paternal archetype. Britannia endured as a mother figure, strong, stoic, watchful, but the father figure had vanished. No George with his sword, no saint or king to offer sacrifice or protection. The empire demanded sacrifice in wars, colonies, and factories, but offered no symbol of shared suffering in return, no figure to bleed with the people. This unresolved tension hardened the national psyche, rational over romantic, efficient over emotional, dutiful, but repressed. Symbolically, Britain became a culture of restraint, an empire ruled by archetypes that neither wept nor bled. For centuries, England's identity had been shaped by intimate symbols: Mary, the nurturing mother; St. George, the courageous martyr; the sovereign king anointed by God. But as empire replaced kingdom and bureaucracy displaced belief, these figures faded. Their power wasn't just lost, it was absorbed and reshaped. In their place rose Britannia, not merely a new emblem, but a symbolic fusion. Where George once fought dragons and Mary offered comfort, Britannia stood armed with trident and shield, commanding loyalty, but not love. She was no intercessor or protector, but a state-sanctioned goddess of order. At her core, she embodied contradiction, feminine in form, masculine in function, a mother who didn't comfort, a warrior who didn't bleed. This ambiguity made her strong, but emotionally hollow. Unlike Mary or George, Britannia inspired allegiance, not devotion. So when empire faded and the nation turned inward, there was no saint or mother to return to, only a symbol too abstract to embrace. Infusing its old myths into one imperial image, Britain had lost its most defining voice. The contrast is stark. St. George, Christian martyr of resistance, sacrifice and spiritual courage. Britannia, pagan goddess of order, conquest and imperial control. St. George defied Rome. Britannia is Rome reborn. This symbolic shift raises a haunting question. Do we celebrate sacrifice or simply demand it? Do we honour the martyr or glorify the machine? In seeking unity, something was lost. No longer called to suffer, only to serve. No longer guided by saints, but by state. No mother, no father, no king, no country. Join me in part 4 as we step into the century of collapse. Through vanishing empire, identity crisis and all-out war, we'll trace what happened to the soul of Britain when everything was on the line. And if you haven't already, subscribe to follow the full series. Until the next chapter, stay curious.